if you do it online.
There it is.
There you go, perfect. All right, welcome to the June installment of the Purple Group book club, where this month or this couple months we read When Darwin Comes to Town, How the Urban Jungle Drives Evolution by Menno Schilthuizen, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's Dutch, if you couldn't tell by that name. And he talks about
Oh, right,
yeah.
Magnus.
Magnus, somebody or other.
Oh yeah, we're getting all the hard European names to pronounce. Yeah, and it's all about the idea of microevolution and how all these animals and nature are thriving and changing rapidly based on kind of the urban landscape. One thing he talks about was of course, the one we always read about in junior high and high school about the moths that went from white to black. Then after the Industrial Revolution and everything went back, the evolution changed back. So I will leave it open and say what Matt or okay, yeah. So if you guys have what were your initial thoughts or things that stood out, Susan, if you'd like to share. I think the first one also that that really captivated me was the mosquitoes in the London Underground and how they have. At first, I thought they're different species. They're not different species, but they have different DNA. And he goes in later and saying how the DNA has to change a certain amount, and there has to be certain enough changes for it to be a different species. But there is noticeable differences in their DNA string through different tunnels because mosquitoes have been isolated enough in the tunnels, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and he repeats that some with the mice, right? That each city block of mice that can't cross the busy road.
Oh yeah.
This other kind of micro, not quite a different species, but a different a variation on the same species, because they have to be connected to this plant or this insect life or these predators that are different, and each block is a different mouse,
Right,
variation.
and each block is kind of its own island.
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he talks about that some with the starlings, that over time they would kind of go from place to place, but then if it's the island eyes like the mosquitoes or like the mice, they can't, right? Because they just can't get from one place to another, and so it just becomes more and more specialized to that place. Yeah.
I didn't actually learn about the moths until I was an adult, proofreading journals for Allen Press. So that was kind of a revolutionary discovery for me.
Well, there was more of a saga to it than I thought, right? So this whole thing came out that it was there's this evolution that was driving their adaptation, and then people debunked it saying, well, actually no, not really, there's this and this, and that came out in like the 90s. And then they came back and did more studies and said, no, the original thing was true. Like they did all these extra, they did tests and people found flaws in the test. And so they redid the test and it still came up with the same conclusion.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And interesting that the studies were more recent.
Mhm.
For something that happened during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, even the story of kind of the study got, there's a little bit of piece lifted from the study. It's like, oh, well, what about this? We could maybe question this part of the study and maybe do it better. And then it said like a creationist mind scholar like picked up that little bit and said, oh, look, it's all messed up, right? It's all fake.
Yeah.
And that's the part that kind of, you know, that's what pricked my ears, right? Because that feels new to me, that, you know, that would be kind of the again, you talked about being more modern within the last 20-30 years. It feels like that kind of anti-science bent of the Christian community feels newer to me. It feels like we got to jump on science, that anything that looks like, you know, science questioning science, or a scientist questioning another scientist, is total proof that it's all made up. That just feels foreign to me. It doesn't feel like the Christianity I grew up with, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to, I guess, to their credit or in their defense, like, I think this happens a lot, regardless of their, you know, political or religious, you know. They said it was a creationist, but I think every scientist has their hypotheses, and therefore a bias to prove that their hypothesis is right. So if someone else comes in and says, oh, here's my study, they're going to be more disposed to try to find and poke holes in it so that their work is deemed right. Like if you do a whole bunch of studies for, you know, years and years, and someone else comes out with something and says that you're wrong, you're going to be heartbroken, right? I mean, so I think there's this idea of now, I mean, I think a good scientist would look past that and say, no, here's my study, and I found, you know, regardless of the result, their work can still have meaning. But I think it's easy for, and I think it's just, it's easy for scientists to want to prove their research more groundbreaking than the next person, because they find.
I
And
feel
it just goes to say, like, that's, I mean, the idea of science isn't, I mean, it's truth finding, but it is also like coming up with idea, testing it. If it's wrong, okay, how is it wrong? Why is it wrong? And continuing that look. And so I think we always think, like, because a scientist says something, we think, oh, that's true. And then all of a sudden, so when we find out that they did the study and it's different, we think, oh, well, they don't know anything they're talking about. It's like, that's not that. No, it's because they're still trying to find the
they're
answer.
still testing it, they're still probing it, to make sure that it's that it's gonna hold water, so to speak.
And there's a lot in there, right? I mean, I think there's definitely something to be said about the of course, I'm running away from the actual science of it to the social science of it, but there's something to be said about the dog eat dog world of academia, that, you know, if one thing, you know, if you see a crack, that's your opportunity to jump on the crack and make a name for yourself, right? And the book kind of said that. There was this one author that said, here's how I can make a name for myself, and I you know, and I know
or they lose their funding, right? I mean, it's not just, I mean, some people are, you know, their ego is involved and they're trying to, you know, prove themselves and their worth, but others are, no, like, this is my funding, this is how I continue to have a job. And so it's
Right. But you know, but then at the same time, it feels like, and then so there was the study, and then the reaction to the study, and then the reaction to the reaction, and then the reaction to that, right? And so there's these kind of different levels. And then you know, in the end, the person who did the first kind of, a little bit of skepticism about the study saw that what was being used, their words were being used to say, well, look, see, all science is wrong. And he was like, wait, what?
Like, no.
Wait, that's not,
I
I didn't say that. That was not. that was not my intention, right?
Right,
And
right.
so.
And then he actually jumped in and doubled
And
down.
then, right, yeah.
And like went to seriously investigate
Yeah,
it.
that-
He was the one
Yeah.
that went on to investigate it further.
Right, which was his point in the first place, right? It
Yeah.
wasn't to say, here's this skepticism because I think all science is wrong.
Right,
It's a skepticism to say, can we drill down and get more accurate on this?
right. And
It-
have more evidence
Right,
that this is
yeah,
really what
yeah.
caused it. Yeah.
But I think that speaks, and maybe Matthew, this is not where you want to go with the conversation at all, but I do think this speaks to the kind of where we are in terms of the fear. I mean, when you talk about, in a lot of Christian circles, we talk about Darwin. I mean, I had a couple times I had somebody see me read this book. It's like, Darwin, no, I don't know about him. I mean, and that kind of that fear in a lot of Christian circles is born from something. It's born from I think a concern that and again we can say again the dog eat dog world of academia, or the there's plenty of kind of this atheism of a lot of scientists. But I think to then throw all of their work out the window and say folks like Darwin are godless, whatever, I think misses the point. I mean, Darwin was a Christian who was trying to make sense of the world that God created and tried to figure that out. And he's just kind of been lambasted for generations now from a lot of Christian angles.
Well, and I don't want to say it's not the anti-scientist people, but it's people who don't understand science interpreting or misinterpreting what his findings are and what he was trying to do. Right.
Right.
So I think it's with anything, right? We try to understand something that we're not familiar with, and we misinterpret how that information and what the implications are.
Right.
Based on our own understanding, not on like the full understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
And then and it's easier to digest that way, right? It's because we don't understand it, we change it to make us understand it, not out of malice, but just out of convenience, or
Yeah. Right.
just intentions.
Yeah. Yeah, Francis Collins talks about that a little bit with the God of the gaps question. Like a lot of creationists will use that language of, well, if there's something that again, there's a little bit of skepticism about this study, or there's something that's missing in the scientific base of knowledge, then the assumption is, oh, look, that's God. But Francis Collins, who's a incredible scientist and an incredible Christian, says actually, there's problems with the God of the gaps theory, because if you do that, then every time you figure out a little bit more about science, then your God gets smaller, as opposed to what he calls biologos theory, which suggests that life, that science is the way that God speaks, logos, the way that God speaks to us. And so he says every scientific discovery is another, 3 cheers for God, right? Here's another opportunity, another revelation of God speaking. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so I think that seems to be this is why I love books like this, because I feel like it for me it's like, oh look, this is how much bigger God is at the end of this book than at the beginning, in my mind, because it speaks to a God that creates through evolution, that says God can create more than just a steak knife. God creates a Swiss Army knife, right? God creates an animal that can evolve and do different things, and all of a sudden become this other thing, depending on what the surroundings are. Again,
And I think it's important for us too. I think that the idea that creation is still creating, that we can still be creating too, like this idea of like we can change, right?
Yeah.
Whether it, for whatever reason, like that, if we feel like we're not complete, or we feel like we have a deficiency, like there's certain things we can do to fix that.
Right.
Like we can adapt to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the theology of transformation is a question here, right? If we say that God created and it's all done, then, A, what does that say about God, who is no longer involved? And B,
Yeah.
what does it say about the world and us in particular that says, well, we're done. We're done changing, we're done transforming. But that doesn't feel like a biblical theology. Biblical theology says that we're always open to God changing us through life, through process,
Mhm.
through relationship. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's not about moths or crows or spiders, but it, it feels appropriate, especially to this conversation, how we're.
Yeah, it's the theological component to it.
Right. Well, I think, I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop talking. I think that I think that when we can acknowledge that the theology is the voice that we can bring to it, right? To say we're gonna know more about science than scientists is kind of not a very humble place to begin, but instead to say, but what we can bring to the table is a language about how that science is impacted and interacts with what we believe God is doing in the world. And so I think we do have a theology, and I think that, here. So as I'm reading this book, I also am reading this thing about, I'm reading about the evangelical tradition, right? Because that's what I preached on last week. And Herschel Hobbs, who I quoted in the sermon last week, has this line in here about scripture. And again, back to your point about it's the theology that scripture talks about. So this is Herschel Hobbs, a Southern Baptist. I mean, this is not, a crazy liberal, way far left. And he writes this, and this is, I don't know exactly what version of this book originally came out in 1971. It was reprinted many times. The latest is 1997. But he says this: to say the Bible is an authoritative book does not mean that it's authoritative in every field of human thought. It is not an authority in science. It does not claim to be. Keeping in mind that the Bible was written in the popular language of the people, still the phrases of creation recorded in Genesis 1 are in harmony with the findings of field of science related to the beginning of things, such as geology, botany, and biology. Right? To say the Bible is supposed to be a science text misses the point of the Bible, I think is what he's saying.
Right.
Instead, the Bible is a theology text, treated as such, right?
Right.
Be thankful that it is as such. So I don't know, that's.
Well, yeah, I mean, on a scripture level, at least my opinion is this scripture talks about the who and the why of creation. Science talks about the how.
Yeah, right. And I think and we can celebrate both. I mean, I think again, we celebrate everything that science teaches us because it teaches us more about the who and it teaches us more about the what, right?
Right. And it seems like a mistake to leave either out,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You miss a point either direction.
Yeah.
It's all part of a whole. And I guess as a Christian, I think that the whole always includes God.
Right. Yeah.
I can't imagine it without God.
Yeah.
How some of those things began, where was that supposed grain of dust or whatever that the big bang from,
right. Yeah.
And Pastor Sandy, I actually had a crisis of faith around evolution, and when I started proofreading, when I read some of that stuff, it was like, oh my gosh, evolution might actually be real. And but I remember Pastor Sandy saying, you don't pin your faith to any one scientific theory, you pin your faith to God, and then the rest of it unfolds.
Right.
New scientific discoveries all the time. We still don't know everything.
Right.
Quantum theory is out there.
Oh my goodness.
I know nothing, just.
I have a book for that one too. Maybe we could read that one of these times. about, it's basically like quantum theory for dummies.
Oh,
I
wow.
read that in the
Oh,
last few
that
months.
would be really
Oh,
helpful.
yeah, I'd read that.
I
Yeah,
read that.
yeah. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
But right, like, so there's discovery on that level
Mhm.
of that we are basically space
Yeah.
with, you know, certain connections
Right.
that are made holding everything together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who knows what else we'll discover in future years.
Right, right.
So to say that anything of that is separate from God, to me, is a mistake.
Right.
But
3 cheers for Pastor Sandy.
right, yeah.
Right. I mean, because I think that, yeah, she helped you and has helped a lot of us, you know, over the years. Kind of say, don't, I mean, that don't feel bad about the crisis, but then here's a,
Right.
in the end, here's
Here's a
God.
way
Yeah,
to,
right.
here's a lens to view it through.
Yeah, yeah.
That will help you understand the bigger picture, I think is what I got from
Yeah,
that.
good. That's great. So, I don't know, I mean, the book isn't about any of this. I don't think. I mean,
Right.
he's figured this part out for himself, I mean, you know, long ago, but I think that one kind of lift from history spoke enough to me to say, yeah, there feels like there's something going on in terms of how we as a people of faith are to read something like this, right? How do we read your science articles? How do we read these things? And not feel like it has to be a threatening thing to our faith.
Right, exactly. And there doesn't have to be that combativeness between religion and science.
Right, yep.
You know, again, as I was reading some of those articles, I began to see that there are evangelicals who are hardcore evolutionists.
Sure.
Just like there are evangelicals who are
Yeah.
hardcore anti-evolutionists.
Right, absolutely.
You know, that are just as combative.
Yeah.
And again, that's not where he's coming from.
Right.
Really with this, he's more about, this was the urban.
Right.
This is what the urban environment created for this species of moth.
Right. But I do think that there is a parallel there. I mean, if you remember one of the early chapters, he writes about the experience of, you know, he had this theory, right? He started thinking about kind of this micro evolution in an urban environment and began to say that this is an important field of study. This is something we should talk about. And a lot of his colleagues, you know, tried to cut him off at the knees and said, well, how dare you talk about this, and how dare. And so again, I think that there is a sense of, instead of us all trying to figure it out together, it becomes a combative thing, whether it's a scientist against a scientist, or a scientist against a creationist, or an evangelical that's an evolutionist versus an evangelical that's not an evolutionist. Like, why can't we all get along, right? I mean, why do we all have to start with this kind of combative perspective or leaning? So I don't know, Matthew. Again, I think I took you down a direction probably weren't planning to go, but
That's all right. I did find it interesting that he talks also about, I think he calls it pre-evolution, but it's basically like a pre-existing condition, where like they're predisposed and already primed for that type of evolution.
pre-adaptive or something?
Pre-adaptive.
Is it pre-adaptive?
Adaptive, that's it. Yeah. I can't remember where it is, but it talks about, you know, animals having to dodge bicycles or
Right,
something with
birds
pigeons.
particularly that could lift off, like their wing shape changed from more pointed and longer to shorter and rounder, and that helped them lift off faster.
Yeah.
So, in the city.
Right, yeah. Which again, I mean, that feels to me like, that feels like a great example of of creation to me. I
Uh-huh.
mean, it feels like, oh, that just is that's God, again, God creating a Swiss Army knife, not a steak knife.
Right. Created to adapt.
Yeah.
which is
Go here.
yeah, I mean, it's also interesting. This is also, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called bio design. But right, I mean, we looked at birds for airplanes, and it's like, yeah, I get it, like the general shape of a wing, but the short stubby and the long skin, like that's the B-1 bomber and the F-14, right? They have variable wings that
Mhm.
basically do both of those for different functions of its use. It's like, wow, oh yeah, like there's we've looked at animals and birds to figure out how to do all this stuff.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I can't find that in me, but yeah, somewhere.
Well, the part about the wings is 98 and 99,
Okay.
bottom of 98, top of 99. But I'm not finding the
Right, what that phrase is.
that phrase.
Even though, what's up with the guy who decided that he needed to bring every bird ever mentioned in Shakespeare's works to the United States?
Right,
So
yeah.
yeah, and there's a garden in San Francisco that
Eugene Scheiflin. Oh,
yeah
sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
yeah I Kylie and I went to San Francisco a couple of summers ago, and there's a garden there that has like a list of them too, and a monument to that kind of stuff that someone decided, these Shakespeare files or whatever you want to call
Right.
them, that think, oh yeah, it's a good idea to like every bird mentioned in Shakespeare.
Oh, it was the European starling.
Right,
Yeah.
which as I go out my back door and my pond is completely covered in starlings and blackbirds and that's, thanks, buddy. Thanks, Eugene. What's
Right,
his name?
it's Eugene
Yeah.
Schiflin, Schiffelin.
Yeah.
The president of the American Acclimatization Society.
Yeah,
Sought
thanks.
as they're calling to improve North America by releasing such foreign varieties of the animal and vegetable kingdom as may be useful or interesting.
Wow. Sorry, I get distracted again, but I was looking for the
Included the bringing into the USA of every bird ever mentioned in Shakespeare's works. Yeah, that was on 97.
that's a great idea. Yeah, I don't know where the part about the
That was around there though.
yeah.
Yeah.
Text gene, where was? That goes back to the moths.
Oh, yeah, I'll talk about that part too. Oh, here it is.
What page are you
On page 64, he's talking about urban environment offers conditions that happen to resemble one or more aspects of a species' way of living in pre-urban times. And it is those species that are pre-adapted to the novel niches in the city. They're the first to move in. Yeah,
Mhm.
so basically here are these birds that are more prepared, because they're already kind of,
Oh, and talks about the wild rock pigeon and how they're adapted to live on the cliffs, rocky cliffs, and now
oh,
they
right,
live on buildings.
the
and-
swallows, the barn
Oh,
swallows. Is
those,
that it?
yeah, let's see. Yeah, there was something about swallows too,
Is that
but
the-
where you are is the
Something
pigeons,
else.
the rock pigeons.
Oh, okay,
And the house crow and the sickle-winged swift
yeah,
oyster catchers. Yeah,
Yeah, just the part about, how you don't think about how cities impact animal life and plant life, but yeah, there's some pretty significant, whether it's the lights or the hum, the sound that's kind of constant, how much of an impact it has.
Oh, yeah, on 67, he does mention a house sparrow.
Okay,
Oh, Chileans.
Yeah, even the hum was like it influenced eating patterns because it changes their beak, which changes the sound,
Yeah.
which changes what they can eat, and it also changes their their mating rituals
yeah, right, yeah,
and all that stuff was interesting.
yeah,
All right, because their beak shape also determines the sound that comes out of it,
Yeah,
which it has to be higher frequency to make it over the hum of the city.
uh-huh. Oh, and the white feathers, the white tail feathers of the
yeah.
juncos, was
Yeah.
fascinating. You remember that part, that if the,
Right, because that meant that they were better fighters or
well,
something
yeah,
like
if they're in the
that?
rural areas, if they had more white on them, then
They're more
they're
attractive.
more attractive to females. There's something about that they're stronger, or they can, like they
Like they can
meet.
defend their territory.
Yeah, that's what it is. They can
better.
defend the
Yeah.
territory
right.
better.
Well, yeah, because there's a link between the amount of testosterone in them and
That's
the
it.
amount of white.
Yep.
That's it. That's
And
it.
obviously, yeah, testosterone also makes them more you know aggressive and able to fight things off and
Yeah.
louder voice and all that stuff.
City one.
But then they get in the city and it's like a bullseye, right? It's like,
right.
here's a nice white tail for the hawk to eat.
Yeah, right.
And so
Yeah.
they become like the bigger, pretty quickly. The
Mhm.
female's like, no thanks. You're like wearing walking around wearing a target on your back.
I
Yeah.
like
Well, and I think
like an ad
humans
that
are similar. I
Right?
think, right? Like the what is what is considered beautiful and all that stuff, right? I mean, there used to be at during I can't remember when it was. It used to be, the heavier you were, the more attractive you were because that meant you have wealth to actually eat.
Right. That's right.
Right,
Yeah.
Or
Mhm.
because, or because the rich were that way. And so we're always attracted to people who are rich, regardless of what they look like. We just want to be
Right.
like them.
Right. Right. And so now there's a move away from the, muscle bound, bodybuilder to if you look like Bill Gates, or a rich industrialist, it's like, oh, that looks attractive to me now.
Right, that's probably the same kind of mechanism.
Right,
actually.
yeah. Well, and just the whole thing is fascinating about how, I mean, I'll admit, I came to the book with an assumption of, the city, the rural areas equal nature and the city equal not nature,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's fascinating, in those early chapters, how he kind of debunked that to talk
Yeah, he
about.
debunks it pretty quick.
Yeah, even to the point of saying, go into the suburbs and that's the most or the least natural area. You've got these, these townhome villages and you've got very oversprayed crops, and everything is on a grid and everything is like super industrial, and so that has nothing to do with natural process. You're actually more likely to find it in an empty city lot with at least some weeds that are probably natives, and yeah. The biodiversity, that's what he talks about early on, that you'll find in cities, often biologically rich areas to begin with. If you open an atlas and look to where the world's biggest cities are, you'll notice they are not on mountain plateaus, deserts, or other biologically poor regions. Instead, they are in the exact same places where we find biodiversity hotspots, estuaries, floodplains, fertile low-lying areas, other places where humans and wildlife alike find plenty of food and many different niches are available.
Yeah, because humans are animals.
Right,
And so
yeah.
that's where we congregated too.
Right, and he really tries to make that point too, that, we tend to see ourselves as being separate from all of that.
Yeah.
Right.
But we are very much a part of it. We're one of the,
Right.
what is the term, was it super? Like
Right,
the
yes.
eco builders.
Right,
It talks about the
Yep.
ants, the beavers. And
Yeah, keystone species, right? We are like the keyest of keystone species, that we're kind of the primary.
Right, for good or bad, we definitely
Right.
influence
Mhm.
the environment. around
Right,
us.
and he finally gets to the bad. I feel like, he's working so hard to make the argument that, humans impacting the natural environment, it's just what it is, and it's a good thing, and it's fine, and we see these adaptations and evolution. And at the end of it, he finally gets to, and also for every species that is able to adapt, there's dozens of species that go extinct
Mhm.
because of what we're doing, right? And so I appreciate the positive, but I think he needs to say the negative,
The
right?
negative too.
Yeah.
Exactly. That species destruction is not ideal, right?
Mhm.
Is causing other problems. And I think that's what got his fellow scientists mad at him, right? Because I think they are ready to say, we just need to make sure everybody gets the point that ending species is a bad thing, and urbanization is destroying species, and all of these things. And he tries to say, yeah, but there are some things that we can look positively.
Yeah.
But they weren't ready for it, which I can see why.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing was him talking, so based on towards the kind of later half of the book, he starts talking about how the idea of the difference in adaptations for city animals versus rural animals are switching enough to become their own species, so they're getting a split. But then he also mentions that there's some places where actually two species are merging back into one.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is pretty fat. Yeah, the Galapagos, because they're urbanizing, because everyone's flocking there. Everyone's starting this urban thing there, and then now all the birds are getting the same beak.
Mm-hmm. Right, because they're instead of these different like micro space, they're all eating off picnic tables.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They're
The junk food.
The junk food off of picnic tables. That's right. Shoot. Oh my goodness! And the chapter about the birds getting the milk out of the milk bottles.
Out of the milk bottles, and the many different iterations of things people tried to get them out of it.
So they put cardboard, and then they cut through the cardboard, and then they put wax, and they chose the wax, and they put metal, and they're like shore the metal off of it to get to this milk.
And we sometimes carry the metal away, and then lick the milk off of the lid and drop it in a pile someplace where they lived, and make a big fuse pile. Crows are smart.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the book, we read that too, about are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? I think he talks about crows in that one.
I think so.
Yeah. I thought of that a couple times as we were reading this one too.
The other part that I remember, and I always forget the exact definitions, but the close encounter, or I want to say close encounters,
right?
Yeah.
The first
of
kind.
the first kind and the second kind.
Yeah. The first kind was just the environment itself, right? Like the city environment, the surfaces, the
more concrete, more glass, more the lights, the sound, all that kind of stuff, and how they react to the,
Right, and it's one way rather
Yeah,
than,
it changes the animal. And then the
right.
second kind is like the ones that have to do with mating rituals, right? Where you adapted to something and then someone else adapts to you.
right, yeah,
I think is what that was.
it made it become more of a, you know, two different species or with interspecies
Yeah.
change. Yeah,
Yeah.
Right,
yeah, and the difference being that, you know, you don't the birds adapting to flying into the glass doesn't change the glass, right?
right.
But when it starts to become a situation of, okay, now that there's glass here, this bird has to do this thing different, which changes the way that they mate, right? So that becomes a
Well,
different.
yeah. I mean, the difference is then we put things on the glass,
Right, yes,
which
yes,
changes it, right? And then they're yeah.
yeah. Or the other example of the second kind was the catfish.
Oh,
The
yeah,
catfish that would like
Right.
throw themselves out of the water and grab a pigeon, drag the pigeon
By
into the
the
water
foot?
by the foot, and then like eat the pigeon out of the water.
I was hearing the Jaws theme
Yeah.
the
Right.
entire time.
Yeah,
Right.
and again, that's a change in the way that the pigeons have changed. You know, that's the first
Right.
kind, but now the pigeons and the catfish are interspecies, not
Yeah.
interspecies change, yeah.
Yeah, and they go back and forth, right? So the catfish has evolved to the point where it will leap out of the water and grab the pigeon and drag it in. So
Right.
the next is, will the pigeon evolve a greater sense of, fear?
Fear of the water, yeah.
And stay away from it more.
Or eat a more, a stronger lift, like they could take off quicker. you
Right,
know, if they
evolve
see-
those rounder, shorter wings to lift off
Or they-
faster.
Right, yeah.
Yep, and so then the catfish could counter evolve.
Yeah. Yeah.
Become quicker to get out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the sense of the close encounters of the second kind.
The second kind, right,
When there was
yeah.
that kind of interaction, one species,
Yeah,
the evolution of the one species perhaps causing the evolution of the other back and forth.
Correct. Yep.
Which I thought was fascinating.
yeah. Yeah, there it is. That's on page like 220.
320.
Some of it is 226, 4, 5, 6. We're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting that, you know, he also says that now that there are more, the cities, the change in the cities means that the more significant, quicker change means the evolution has to come quicker, you know, that they're gonna be, that they will become extinct if they're
Yeah.
not coming, more quickly.
Right, yeah.
Oh, and then he doesn't say this kind of as a third kind, but he then says, well, what about humans? What are we evolving
Right.
to live in cities differently?
Uh-huh.
And that goes, I mean, early in the first part of the book, he talks about kind of the mega urban experience, that there's so much that, what is it now, just a few years ago, that more people lived in cities than outside of cities.
Mhm.
And that trend is just speeding up.
Mhm.
And so how is this changing us? How are we evolving to live in cities differently?
Right.
Mhm.
You gotta think it has to.
Yeah, right.
I couldn't think of examples of how we might be evolving to live in cities, but I thought of examples of how, things we put in the environment are affecting us. Like
Yeah,
the stuff that we put in our water,
Mhm.
and
Right.
how, like,
The plastic that we ingest.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
that are causing hormonal disruptions in
Mhm.
children,
Yeah, right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, he says on 228, he says, other researchers have found evidence for city-specific human evolution. For example, in parts of the world where urbanization began earlier, more people carry immune system genes that help fight tuberculosis. Organisms that cause or spread such diseases do so more easily where people are densely packed, even in today's modern cities. That will affect the evolution of our immune systems. So yeah, there's things that are already changing. Matthew, I was curious what your take on some of the green architecture at the very end.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
I missed that section. I hadn't finished it. I had a bunch of stuff come up the last couple of days.
Yeah, that chapter 20, design it with Darwin. I'd love to
Yeah, I
hear.
just started it, so I hadn't gotten too far. But yeah, I'll read it and see. It's interesting about green art. I mean, it's this idea of, we're trying to find new ways to do things that is more sustainable. And my idea is the more sustainable is stop doing it. Right? I mean, we always try to find better ways to do it. And I think that's a good thing, but I think we also need to say, okay, like, do we need to be doing as much?
Right, yeah.
Like, you can find something that's sustainable, but it's not going to beat building less. How can we do it more efficiently by using less building materials, not a substitution for?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the
But that's my
topics,
comments without reading the chapter, so he may be talking
Yeah.
about something completely different.
Right.
I mean, the weird thing is, like,
like,
it used to, it's kind of on the tail end, but it used green walls and putting, plants on the outside of our buildings and garden terraces and stuff were kind of a big hip thing to do in your designs in school, at least. But the idea of, like, the structure needing to hold that up because plants are heavy, because plants need soil and water is heavy, like, you're
Right.
adding more structure to your building, which means you're building a more expensive building to do, like, it's just an offset. Like, you just don't do it.
Yeah, yeah.
curious. This was published in 2018,
Uh-huh.
and that was probably on the upswing then. I kind of wonder where it is now.
Right,
You
right.
know, with that kind of a trend. He did say at the top of 234. Let's see, maybe starting at bottom of 233. What you won't read in those books or hear in those presentations is how these new trends in green roofing, nature inclusive building, and green urbanism affect the ongoing evolution of urban ecosystems. By and large, urban ecologists, ecological architects, and green planners assume that the animals and plants that they release in their urban environment are static, that the roles they play in the network of city life will remain unchanged. But as we've seen in this book, this may be a miscalculation.
Yeah.
There's always a urban evolution. The question is, what's the crosstalk between urban evolution and urban architecture?
Right, yeah, yeah. Okay, well, fascinating stuff. This is good.
All right, so we'll wrap up here, but let me find it. So our next book, I believe, is for August, is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I think the Sojourners have read the book, but I have not. So that's the next one. It's the next couple of months.
Okay.
Get a copy of that. Not
So
using Amazon, please.
The last week of August, right? And we'll be back at 6:30.
Back at
Correct.
6:30.
Yep.
Okay.
Subject to change, but
All right. Sounds good. Great conversation all.
Yep.